Hello everybody, what we have here is a piece of oak strip wood. It's a 3 by 2 inches, sorry 3 by 1 inches. Let me measure that. It's 5 centimeters by 1.5. So yeah, roughly 3 by 1. What I'm going to do with this today is make some stars out of this, stars like this. But I'm going to make them on a miter saw. There's a few videos out there of people making this kind of star on a table saw. I don't have one of those because of space, so I'm going to do it on a miter saw. The process is similar, but there are some key differences which I'll point out to you as I go along. You'll need a few things for this. A ruler is an obvious one, some wood glue, and of course a clamp and a bit of scrap wood which we'll be using as a marker in our miter saw later on. Oh yes, one other thing which I should have mentioned was it would be very handy to have one of these digital angle gauges. You could use a protractor, but something like this which is quite accurate is ideal, and you can get them for 10-15 euros on eBay, and occasionally they pop up in places like Aldi and Lidl. So the first thing we need to do now is make a few checks. If you're cutting with a table saw, you know that the maximum height that you can cut is the height of the blade minus a few millimeters for safety. Same sort of thing applies with miter saws, except you have to take a bit more off. So you need to check the width between the bolt that holds the blade on and the base of the saw when the saw is pressed down. That is the maximum width the star can be, and I would take 5 millimeters off that just for safety, so you got a bit of room to play with. And the measurement is 8 centimeters. This means the widest point of the star can be 7.5 millimeters. This is important because if the bolt touches the star as it goes through the saw, it'll send it flying backwards. And there's also a bit of flexibility in a lot of miter saws, so even though you think you can only push the blade down so far, there's always a bit of give, and you can always push it a little bit more, which might cause that bolt to come into contact with the whatever you're cutting. So what we do now is set up our angles. In the world of the miter saw, 0 is what would be 90 degrees to everyone else, because most of the time you are cutting pieces at 90 degrees. We need to set the miter saw to 30 degrees, so the actual cutting angle is 120. I slide the miter over to 30 degrees, and there is a detent here that stops it. However, you can't be too sure with these detents on how accurate they are. So I'm going to set the angle gauge to 120 and lock it in position. As we pull the blade down, you can see that it isn't quite exactly 30 degrees off center. So we can't rely on the detents in the saw to be accurate. So we're going to make a few adjustments first of all. So we need to pull up the shield so it doesn't get in the way, and nudge the miter over a little bit. So it's not quite right there. Give it a little bit of a nudge, and I think we have it. So before we start cutting, I like to give the saw a bit of a brush out, because specks of sawdust and wood shavings can actually affect the accuracy of the cut, and its accuracy is very important with this little project. So I'm just going to cut off a bit at the end, the shortest piece I can, to give me a complete cut through. So the next thing we have to do is work out how long each piece we are going to cut shall be. To do that, we need to figure out the maximum width of the star, and we're going to be cutting the wood diagonally like this. So using a star I made earlier as an example, we're going to measure the widest part. So the widest part isn't from tip to tip as you might think, it's from these top flat parts. It's across the flat part here. And we can see that is 7.5 centimeters, so that's perfect. So he's dancing around. What a happy star. So I'm going to measure out 3.75 centimeters because that's half of 7.5, I hope. And that is how wide each piece of wood cut is going to be. So I've got a little piece of wood here which I'm going to clamp into position and use as my gauge to ensure every piece is cut accurately every time. You don't have to mark each cut out in pencil when you do this, so long as you don't move that piece of wood inadvertently. So here we go, we're going to start cutting. I like to cut with the wood upwards because the wood I have is short. Let's push out. It's important to wait for the blade to stop before lifting it because the small pieces of wood will go flying if the blade is still spinning, and you'll lose them, or they could bounce off the wall and hit you in the face and give you a bit of an injury. So we'll speed things along now because we can. Isn't modern technology wonderful? One, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So here we are now, we're going to start gluing them together. Now I like to glue them together in pairs to begin with, and then once we have 3 pairs glued together, I do a second gluing which brings the whole star together. So the way I'm aligning them is that I want for each pair to have the grain in the same parallel direction, so it makes the star look good and is consistent. So we bring them together like that and you can see what the final star would look like. It's important here to check for any gaps. If the angle wasn't perfectly cut, you'll notice gaps, and the only way you can really fix that is maybe use a belt sander to try and adjust them, but that's quite hard to do properly. So that's why it's very important to be accurate with the angles to begin with. So now I'm just going to start gluing them together. I'm using a fast-acting wood glue made by a company called Alcolin. It works well, but if you put too much on, it doesn't dry as fast as it says. It also doesn't dry as fast in colder conditions. You only need a very thin layer of glue. You don't want the glue coming out the sides because that will be hard to scrape and sand off, particularly in the sort of concave areas of the star. So I've got a clamp here which I'm going to use to clamp them all together once I've done the gluing. So what I do is align them up like so as I keep knocking them over. Once I've got them lined up, I will grab my clamp and give them a squeeze. So just give them a gentle clamping so you've got the ability to sort of adjust them before tightening up the clamp. It's very important that you get the pieces aligned up correctly, because if you don't, when you bring the full star together, it won't connect properly. You'll find that maybe one side meets up perfectly but the other side has a gap. So there we go. Give that a tighten up and we'll leave it. So here we are, all sorted with the glue. It's all dried up and hardened. We break them apart because sometimes a bit of stray glue can hold the pairs together. Give them a bit of sand if there's any rough edges or bits hanging off. You can do it by hand or use a machine. I don't care. I'm not your boss or anything like that. So I just put them together to see that there's no gaps. And luckily there aren't. It fits together lovely. Now if you did have a gap, it would kind of look like that. Maybe not as exaggerated, but it would look like that. There would be a gap between pieces of the star. So the best way to hold it together when you've glued it is using elastic bands, and I have quite a collection of them. Colourful, aren't they? I stole them from my children. So just put a little bit of glue on the insides of the star pieces and give it a bit of a spread out. Just rub it out nicely, and give it a good old spread, like spreading butter on bread. Oh, Marmite. Marmite's a nice thing to spread as well. I like Marmite on my toast. A sandwich bread with the consistency of an industrial lubricant. So we put some elastic bands on to tighten things up and spread them out a bit so the load is even. You don't want an uneven load. Let's give it a bit of squeeze and an adjustment just to make sure everything's lined up correctly. Another reason for not putting too much glue on is it will slip and slide more if you do, making it harder to get an accurate match when you're trying to get these aligned. Yep, that's starting to look a bit good. Maybe put a few more on for... I'm happy with that, and we'll come back when it's set. And it's set. So the next thing we need to do is take off the bands and glue on a piece of 2x4. And that is to allow us to put it through the miter saw without getting our hands too close to the blade, because if you tried to put this through the miter saw while holding on to just the star, you are losing a few fingers. So I'm using wood glue. Some of the videos I've seen online where other people do this on a table saw, they use hot glue. That doesn't work for this. Using a table saw, the blade comes forward, so it drags the star into the table, so the piece of wood only has to hold on to the star sideways. In this case, with a miter saw where the blade spins backwards and lifts up, you're both moving it sideways and having to keep it flat against the table saw base, sorry, the miter saw base as well. And hot glue just doesn't have enough strength to do that. You have to use wood glue. So I'm going to give it a bit of a dollop here and glue it on, and then put it in the clamp to set. Maybe a little bit more. It doesn't matter if it seeps out of the edges at this part. So we need to make sure the bottom of the star is aligned with the base, and that no part of the star points forward of the 2x4, because if it does, it'll hit against the fence and you won't be able to cut the stars out straight. So give it a bit of a squeeze. 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 So yep, so we'll let that set and we'll come back later on. And we're back. So now we're ready to sort. It's all set nice and solid. We'll take the bands off, which I should have done previously, but I didn't. And we will go and cut it. So here we are. I'm going to put it in the saw itself. I'm not using the clamp. I don't think I need it. I hope that doesn't come back to bite me. So we press it up against the fence. Press it, make sure we hold it firm, and it's very important that you hold it firm and straight, because you're cutting an unusual piece. You're cutting an unusually shaped object, so extra care is necessary. If you don't cut it properly, or you don't have it in straight, or it isn't glued on properly, you'll end up with something like this, which isn't nice. It's a waste, so bear that in mind. So move the saw back to 0 degrees or 90 degrees, depending on how you look at it. You see me doing a lot of gesticulating there. I can't remember what I was talking about, but for people who like gesticulation, this is probably enjoyable. As you can see, I have a stop block here, the same one I used earlier, but I've changed its location so the cuts are a bit thinner. How thick to cut can be a bit of a personal choice. I generally go with about 4mm, so I'm adjusting it now to have 4mm cuts. So depending on the wood, you could go a bit thinner. This whole thing doesn't really work with soft woods like pine or spruce. They're too soft and will disintegrate too easily. But for most hardwoods, 3-4mm is good enough. You can go thicker if you want, but going thinner, they'll probably get a bit fragile. So I'm about to start making my first cut. Everything's in position, so let's get on with it. Feck. Well, as you can see, that didn't work as intended. The glue didn't dry hard and well enough, so this time I did this one and left it sitting 24 hours just to be sure. It is the one that got damaged yesterday, but waste not, want not. I'm going to try and get a few stars from this anyway. So let's get started. Open it all up and unscrew the lock, because I put all this away last night. The first successful star, very nice. So push it in against the stop block again. I am using the clamp this time just to be certain I don't make any more silly mistakes. See how we go with the second one. Again, very nice. I have to reiterate that you do need to wait for the blade to stop before trying to take the star out, because it will go flying as the blade winds down. The carbide tips will clip it and send it flying. So I'm just going to speed things up because we can. And that actually cut away from the piece of wood, the 2x4, perfectly. So I was kind of lucky with my measurements. There is a little bit of damage on these, but that'll sand out. A few teeth marks and stuff like that. That one's got the point of one of the stars missing. That happens occasionally. It's hard to avoid when you're sawing something that gets thin with a big blade. So now we can sand them down if you want to. You don't have to, but you might want to. And yeah, that's pretty much it. You might want to drill a hole as well if you want to use it as a Christmas decoration and hang it off a tree. So what I do in a situation like that is I would get a bit of masking tape to stop the grain splitting as you drill in, and just drill away. You probably should be a bit more accurate than I am here, but whatever. These drill bits aren't the greatest. Probably got them in Lidl or Aldi or somewhere like that. There, they take their time to get through the wood, so they're not the greatest. Put a bit of wood underneath so I don't drill from my bench. I'll just try and position myself so you can see it.
Drill.
And there we go. Very nice. Wouldn't that look great? Look great on someone's tree. Like I say, you can give them a kids decorate, maybe do some pyrography on them, or, you know, the world's your oyster. There you go. 6 nice stars. Thank you. Bye-bye.